Julian Sterling didn't live a life. He managed it like a quarterly report, without a single surplus line. Every move was pre-programmed: wake at 5 a.m. box with his private trainer, at 6 drink a kale smoothie prepared by his personal chef, at 7 and be seated in the boardroom on the 71st floor of Sterling Tower by 8 sharp, where the financial world of New York held its breath for every nod he gave. But tonight, everything was still. Too still. He stood alone by the window of his Upper East Side penthouse, a glass of 30-year-old Macallan in hand, reflecting the night lights from Central Park. Another takeover had just been completed, a family business, 3 generations strong, crushed in just 2 weeks of cold negotiation. As always, without a flicker of emotion, without a second thought. His phone rang. The screen lit up. Catherine Vance. A flawless M&A, her voice poured like honey over a blade. "We should celebrate tonight, just the two of us." Julian swirled the glass in his hand, eyes still locked on the city below. "I have something to take care of." "Of course," Catherine replied coolly, laced with implication. "Mr. Sterling is always busy." The call ended. He set the glass down on the table, next to the only thing in his apartment with no market value, an old, slightly faded photo. In it, a young boy beamed beside an older man, the two sitting on a small wooden fishing boat in the middle of a lake. The man was Arthur Sterling, Julian's grandfather, the founder of Sterling Industries. Arthur had once been his hero, a leader by heart, not just numbers. But after the betrayal 5 years ago, when Julian's former fiancée colluded with a rival to steal a key contract, his heart locked itself shut. He turned himself to steel, cold, hardened, untouchable. The phone rang again. Unknown number. Julian nearly silenced it, but a calm female voice came through, urgent yet controlled. "Sterling, I'm calling from the sanctuary. Your grandfather, Arthur Sterling, has just suffered a severe stroke. We've moved him to the intensive care unit." The world cracked open. Julian froze. His grip tightened around the phone. No words came. No one had ever said grandfather and the end in the same sentence to him. Everything in Julian's life had always been coded. But there was no protocol in his system for grief. He turned away from the window, for the first time in years, not to attend a meeting or sign a multi-million-dollar deal, but to face the one thing money could never control: time running out. The sanctuary was unlike any place Julian had ever stepped into. No clattering keyboards, no glinting Patek watches, or Italian leather shoes gliding past marble corridors. Here, everything was soft, gentle, and slow. The building nestled quietly on the banks of the Hudson River, surrounded by Japanese cherry gardens and stone paths, where elderly residents sat in silence on white-painted benches, gazing at the water reflecting the twilight sky. For many, this was the final destination, but a dignified one. Not sterile like a hospital, nor fragmented like a low-end nursing home. To Julian, it felt suffocating. He walked through the lobby as if stepping into a world without words. No LED lights, no phones ringing off the hook, no profit and loss charts mounted on walls. Just one kind of silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that waits for the inevitable. Arthur's room was at the far end of the third-floor hallway. The door was slightly ajar. Julian paused for a moment, one hand resting on the polished brass handle. He wasn't sure he was ready to see Arthur Sterling, no longer the lion of the pack. He pushed the door open. Arthur lay there, the same man who once convinced 3 major investment banks to build Sterling Industries from nothing, now motionless, an oxygen tube resting against his cheek, eyes half open but unfocused. Beside him sat a woman with neatly tied brown hair, a thin face, and strikingly bright eyes. She was gently wiping his hand with a warm cloth, whispering something in Spanish. Not the usual nurse lines like "How are you feeling today?" but a story, a melody told through words. Julian stepped in, but she didn't turn. He cleared his throat softly, as if his presence should be instinctively acknowledged. She looked over, calm, unafraid, not flustered, and certainly not deferential. "Mr. Sterling," she asked, rising gently, "I'm Eleanor, your grandfather's nurse." Julian glanced around the room. Photos of Arthur as a young man hung on the walls and a small pot of lavender by the window. Far too modest for the standards he was used to. "This room is too small," he said, with the tone of someone finalizing a deal. "I want my grandfather moved to the largest suite here, fully equipped. Call in the best private team from Johns Hopkins. Cost is not an issue." Elena didn't frown. She didn't smile. She didn't retreat either. She simply tilted her head and replied, her voice clear and resonant like a glass bell. "Sir, your grandfather doesn't need a bigger room. He needs your presence." A bloodless cut. Yet Julian felt his chest tighten, as if stabbed straight through. He turned toward Arthur. And then something strange happened. In the moment, Elena leaned down and whispered something into his ear. A faint smile crossed Arthur's worn face. Just for a second, then gone as his eyes met Julian's. That gaze, silent, cold, distant. Julian looked away. He had once moved stock markets with a single statement. But to the man who'd taught him how to fish, who placed his hand on a steering wheel for the first time, he was now nothing more than a shadow standing in the doorway. Julian started returning to the sanctuary every day, not for his grandfather, at least not at first, but because he couldn't seem to pull his gaze away from Elena Martinez. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known. She didn't flatter, wasn't awed by the name Sterling, and didn't try to make her presence feel important. She moved like a breeze, gently adjusting the pillow behind Arthur's back, massaging his hand with peppermint oil, even placing an old radio on the wooden shelf by the bed. A relic by modern standards, yet it seemed to hold something Julian couldn't quite understand. On the third day, as she was changing the bedsheets, she turned and gave him a soft smile for the first time since they met. "He asked about you," she said, with his eyes. Julian didn't respond. He sat down in the wooden chair by the bed, tilting his head slightly to look at his grandfather. Not a single movement, but he stayed. For the first time, he didn't check his email, didn't attend a Zoom meeting, didn't take a single call. By the seventh day, he walked in to find Elena pushing in an old phonograph, a vintage walnut Victrola. "What are you doing?" Julian asked, his voice a little sharp, a reflexive defense. "Trying to wake a memory," she answered. "Music is the last thing memory lets go of." She gently lowered the needle into the groove. The first notes of Miles Davis's Blue in Green filled the room. Soft, deep, full of longing. And then a miracle happened. A single tear, out of nowhere, slowly slid down the wrinkled cheek of Arthur Sterling. Julian froze. A surge of emotion welled up in his chest, wild and uncontainable. Something that felt a lot like yearning. Eleanor stood, still silent. She didn't need to speak. She had already proven something. There are things power can't demand, and money can't buy. Later, as the two of them sat on a bench outside the hallway, Julian finally spoke. "When did you start that music program 4 years ago?" "I fundraised it myself. A few small donors, some jazz nights with local bands, and a lot of homemade pie." Why? She turned to him, eyes bright, yet steady. "Because music is where memory lives. When someone can no longer recall their own name, they can still hum the song from their teenage years." Julian sat silent for a long while. He didn't know what to say. Everything he was used to, data strategy investment, suddenly felt hollow in the face of something so fragile, yet so real. And then, without quite knowing why, he began to talk. About summer mornings at Lake Greenwood, where Arthur taught him how to hold a fishing rod. About their first time buying a beat-up old car together. About that ridiculous memory of trying to hide a math test he'd flunked. Elena didn't interrupt. She just listened, as if every memory he offered was its own unspoken melody. That day, for the first time in years, Julian didn't feel like the CEO of an empire. He was simply a grandson, learning how to be human again. All of Manhattan's financial elite eagerly awaited the annual Sterling Industries charity gala held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Invitations weren't sold to the public. Attendance was strictly upper echelon Wall Street CEOs, political donors, a few celebrities, and those whose names alone on a donor wall could send shockwaves. And then 1 week before the event, Julian asked Eleanor, no hints, no metaphors. This Saturday, come with me. Elena nearly dropped her tray of medication. To your gala. It's not my gala, it's the company's, and I want you there. She gave a nervous laugh, as if he'd just invited her to another planet. I don't own an evening gown, Julian. Then borrow one, or just wear your white blouse. Who's going to stop you? He said it half in jest, half serious, but his eyes were more sincere than she'd ever seen. And in the end, she said yes. That night, Elena stepped into the Met's grand lobby as though entering a world made of crystal ornate chandeliers, mirrored walls reflecting hundreds of tuxedos and flowing silk gowns. She wore a classic black dress, borrowed from her cousin, simple yet heartbreakingly elegant. Julian waited for her at the base of the grand staircase. He didn't say a word at first, just stared, as if all sound in the room had ceased. You don't need to sparkle, he whispered. You are the light this place was missing. To the smooth sounds of a live jazz band they danced. Eleanor was clumsy at first, but Julian guided her as if they'd rehearsed across lifetimes. His eyes never left her. When I'm with you, he murmured, I can finally breathe. But the world doesn't pause for two people in love. Not when Catherine Vance was still in it. While Julian was pulled away for a photo with Senator Daniels, Elena stood alone near the banquet table. Catherine approached, stunning in a sapphire sequin gown like a goddess carved from frost. You're adorable, Catherine began with a half smile. But you need to understand. Julian is a hunter. He likes novelty. You're an experience, a project. And soon, when the curiosity fades, he'll return to his world, a world where people like you don't belong. Elena was about to respond, but Catherine gently lifted her champagne glass, as if what she'd said was merely a friendly suggestion. The board will never accept a nurse, and Julian, no matter his feelings, is still a Sterling. Don't let yourself get hurt. No anger, no insult, just a needle razor sharp piercing the most vulnerable place. Elena left moments later. Not a word. By the time Julian returned, she had vanished into the sea of guests and crystal light. He looked around, panic rising, as if he'd just lost something no insurance policy could ever replace. Julian was used to finding answers in any situation, whether it was a billion-dollar deal collapsing or a PR crisis erupting at midnight. But tonight, amidst suits draped carelessly over chairs, a half-removed tie, and a shirt with 2 buttons torn open in haste, he couldn't find Eleanor. She had vanished like a song that stopped mid-verse. No answer on her phone. Not at the sanctuary. Nowhere had he ever seen her frequent. Julian confronted Catherine the very next morning in the glass-walled office on the 70th floor, where sunlight glinted off her face as sharp as a blade. I was protecting the company, Catherine said, her hand resting gently on a contract envelope like a veiled threat. That girl is making you lose control. Emotion is a luxury this empire can't afford. Julian let out a bitter laugh, one more painful than anger. You just called that girl the only person in this city who still sees my grandfather as a human being. Yes, Catherine replied, unblinking, as a human, but not as a Sterling. That was the final cut. Julian walked out without another word. That evening, he stood outside a modest apartment in Jackson Heights, Queens. No driver, no Bentley, just himself for the first time in his life, knocking uninvited like an ordinary man. The door opened, and Eleanor, with messy tied-back hair and red, weary eyes, looked at him like he was a memory that wasn't supposed to return. "Julian," she whispered. "Don't close the door," he said immediately, voice hoarse. "Please, just a few minutes." She hesitated, then stepped aside. The room was small but warm, lined with books, a pot of lavender, and an old worn-out couch. A different world entirely from the cold penthouse he called home. "You were right," Julian began. "I don't belong in your world." Elena lowered her eyes. "And I don't belong in yours." Silence. Only the soft ticking of a clock filled the space between two hearts beating out of sync. "I used to think I was invincible," Julian said, his gaze darkening. "After the person I loved most betrayed me for a contract. I turned myself into a balance sheet. No profit, no loss, just neutral, emotionless." He drew a deep breath. "But then I met you, and I realized I've never actually lived. I've just been auditing my life." Elena clenched the sleeve of her shirt. But she didn't interrupt. "I'm not just falling for you, Elena," Julian said, voice trembling but steady. "I'm becoming human because of you. You don't belong in my world. You're saving me from it." Tears streamed down her cheeks, not from pain, but because her heart no longer had a reason to deny that truth. He didn't beg, didn't push. He simply sat there bare and vulnerable, like a man finally willing to let someone see who he really was. After a long pause, Elena finally spoke. "Are you sure? You're ready to leave your world behind?" Julian nodded. "Not because I'm sure, but because I know if I don't, I'll lose everything." Monday. A summons for an emergency board meeting was sent out at 6 a.m. No lengthy subject line, no explanation. But within New York's financial circles, whispers had already spread Julian Sterling was about to be dethroned. The reason clear: emotional instability, potentially damaging to the reputation and leadership integrity of the corporation. The evidence leaked photos of Julian leaving a shabby apartment in Queens. A mysterious video clip shows him dancing with Eleanor in the Met's Grand Hall. Anonymous messages claiming he was losing his mind over a nurse. It all moved too swiftly, too precisely. Catherine was behind it all. Julian knew, and he wasn't surprised. An empire built on power will always attract those lurking to snatch the crown. But that morning, instead of heading straight to Sterling Tower, he took a detour to the sanctuary. Arthur was still lying there, eyes shut, breath as fragile as thread. But Julian sat down and held his hand. For the first time, he wasn't there to check on vitals. He was there to confess. "I was wrong," Grandpa Julian whispered, voice unsteady. "I thought power was what you wanted me to achieve. So I did everything at the cost of losing myself." He bowed his head, forehead touching the back of that frail hand. "I let you down." A minute passed, then two. Nothing changed until the faintest motion. His grandfather's hand gently tightened around his, so faint it could have been the breeze. But Julian felt it without a doubt. Arthur's eyes opened slightly, In the haze, a flicker appeared not of life, but of memory, a spark from long ago. He rasped each word, a battle for breath clause, legacy, safe. Julian froze. That single phrase unlocked a corridor of memory. When he was 12, Arthur had once brought him into his office and pointed to the old safe hidden behind a framed oil painting. If one day you feel everything is lost, he had said, open this. Real legacy doesn't live in financial reports. Julian left the sanctuary like a man who'd just received the final code to save a crumbling kingdom. He returned home and opened the safe, and just as Arthur had said, inside was a copy of the original founding charter of Sterling Industries, signed by Arthur and the original co-founders. On the last page, in faded blue ink, was a tiny clause, Section 27, the Legacy Clause. Each year, a minimum of 5% of Sterling Industries' net profits must be reinvested into community initiatives, end-of-life care education, and memory restoration arts. Any action to reduce or eliminate this clause may constitute grounds for immediate termination of any sitting CEO. Catherine had buried it on purpose, but his grandfather had preserved it like a bomb waiting to be triggered. It was the lion's final roar, a roar that didn't need to scream, just a whisper, but enough to shake the throne Catherine was clawing to seize. That morning, the boardroom on the 71st floor of Sterling Tower felt like a closed courtroom, cold, white lights, glossy black leather chairs, and a row of executives sitting upright like a jury in tailored suits. Catherine sat at the head of the table, slim poised, wearing the faint smile of someone who believed the verdict had already been signed the night before. Julian entered slowly. No assistant, no legal counsel. The board members' eyes followed him, some curious, some uneasy, some impatient. Catherine opened the meeting, her tone clipped like an internal memo. Thank you for being here, Mr. Sterling. As stated, this emergency session is to assess your continued suitability as CEO given recent behaviors that suggest a decline in the judgment expected of this office. Julian didn't interrupt. He simply took his seat, placing his hand calmly on the polished ebony table. The photos of you leaving a residence unbecoming of your position, the questionable personal entanglements, and your apparent drift from our medium-term growth strategy are deeply concerning. Catherine continued, her voice as precise as a formal indictment. In the interest of shareholder confidence and corporate stability, I propose an immediate vote of no confidence. A beat of silence. Julian stood. No speech, no PowerPoint, no financial summaries, just a worn stack of paper placed on the table. This is a copy of Sterling Industries' original founding charter, he said, voice steady and resonant. Last page. The legacy clause. He read each word aloud. Every syllable landed like a nail into the frosted ceiling. 5% of annual net profit must be reinvested into the community. Ignoring this clause violates the ethical foundation of the company and is grounds for the removal of any CEO regardless of their influence. The room shifted. Faces once indifferent now grew alert. Catherine leaned slightly forward, face unreadable, but her fingers tightened on the chair. Julian continued, I'm not here to beg for votes. I'm here to remind you why this room even exists, because Arthur Sterling didn't just build a company. He built a vision to make money without losing soul. He paused, looked each member in the eye. No pressure, just an invitation. I won't fight for the seat, but I offer a choice. Stay on Catherine's path, pure profit, emotionless, and ultimately empty. Or come with me and build a legacy that still has a heartbeat. He opened a second document. I'm founding the Sterling Music and Memory Foundation, inspired by a nurse who believed jazz could stir fading memories. We'll launch community therapy centers across the country, starting with this year's profits. The boardroom was silent. No applause, but no sneers either. Then the first hand went up. Lawrence, the eldest board member, once Arthur's closest friend. I vote for Julian. Next came the woman on the left, the legal counsel nodding slowly. Then a third, then a fourth. Catherine shot to her feet. This is emotional theatre, cheap and manipulative, and you misjudged the one thing my grandfather always believed in. Julian cut in, raising his voice for the first time, that in the end, people still choose the heart. The vote concluded. Julian retained his position not through strategy, but through awakening. That evening, the sanctuary called. Arthur had passed away in his sleep quietly, as he had lived through the last 5 years of his life. But the night nurse recalled when Blue and Green played softly from the radio in the room next door. He smiled. 1 year later. No red carpet, no crystal chandeliers, no media coverage. But in a quiet lot in Brooklyn, once an abandoned warehouse, soft jazz drifted through the air, pulling laughter behind it like sunlight on a morning breeze. The Sterling Music and Memory Center, its first branch, was officially open. Julian wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't need to. He wore a simple white shirt sleeves, rolled up, crouched down, chatting with an elderly man in a wheelchair, both tapping their feet to the rhythm of Ain't Misbehavin'. No one recognized him as the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation. No one had to. Here he was, just Julian, the founder of a center where every room had music, every hallway was bathed in soft light, and every staff member was trained to lead with respect above all. Elena approached, hair neatly tied back, a folder in hand, now the National Director of Therapeutic Programs. They shared a look that needed no words. Her hand slipped into his. He gave it a gentle squeeze, not to prove anything, just to say, we're here, together. In the backyard, a group of student volunteers played live jazz. An elderly black woman sang along, voice trembling, but full of soul. A middle-aged man broke down in tears, hearing the song he once danced to with his mother at 14. Julian stood quietly in the corner, watching it all, not to control, but to feel. A young staff member approached. Mr. Sterling, someone from City Hall is here about the new grant proposal. Julian smiled. Just call me Julian, and let them wait a moment. I'm listening to the music. Elena gave a soft laugh, leaning gently on his shoulder. You've never looked more like your grandfather. Julian replied softly, eyes still on the courtyard. It's not that I've become him. It's because of him and you that I've finally become myself. Final shot. The camera slowly pulls away. The Sterling Center glows amid a renewing neighborhood, not as a symbol of power, but as a new heartbeat in a gray city. On the red brick wall, hand-painted words read, "Music is where memory lives." Julian bends down and kisses Eleanor's forehead just as the next song begins, "Someone to Watch Over Me." And he whispers, "Real legacy isn't the buildings that bear your name. It's the songs people will never forget." In a world where everything seems buyable, some things only arrive when we dare to let go of control, dare to face our wounds, and dare to love with an open heart. So what will you choose? A hollow legacy or a life with a heartbeat? If this story touched you, please like, comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to Toch Story so you never miss the stories that move your heart. Because some things can't be bought, they can only be become.